The pain was a dull, insistent hum beneath the surface of everything. It lived in my abdomen, a tight, stitched-together line that protested every breath. The day after my surgery, the world had shrunk to the four walls of our bedroom, the scent of antiseptic clinging to the sheets, and the low rhythmic puffing of the supplemental oxygen machine. Keith sat at the edge of the bed, his back to me, the light from his phone casting a blue, impersonal glow on his face. He hadn't touched me since he'd brought me home from the hospital. He'd placed a glass of water on the nightstand, just out of comfortable reach, and retreated to his digital world. I had been watching the space between his shoulder blades for 10 minutes, trying to gather the energy to ask him to move the glass closer, when he finally spoke without turning around. The silence that followed his words was different. It was suddenly heavy, solid. The gentle puff of the oxygen machine sounded like a gasp. In that moment, the surgical pain became a distant echo, replaced by a new ache, sharper and colder, that had no physical location at all. It was the sound of a foundation cracking, a quiet, internal catastrophe that no one else could hear. My name is Alana. I am 34 years old, and for a living I manage people. As an HR manager in Baltimore, my entire professional life is built on the architecture of human systems, policies, procedures, job descriptions, and conflict resolution. I draft the documents that define roles, clarify expectations, and outline consequences. I believe in the power of clear language and understood boundaries. It's my job to ensure that support structures exist to help people succeed, but also to recognize when a partnership, be it with an employee or a company, has become fundamentally misaligned. For 12 years, I had been married to Keith. He was 37. We had been together long enough that our routines had the worn, smooth feel of river stones. Long enough, I thought, to have built a shared life with its own set of unwritten policies, its own implicit contract of mutual care. In HR, you learn that the most dangerous agreements are the ones that are never written down. They rely on assumptions, and assumptions are the hairline fractures that, under pressure, can bring the whole structure down. I had assumed our contract was one of partnership. I was about to learn that Keith had been operating under a different clause entirely, one of ownership. The inciting wound, when it came, was not delivered with a shout. It was delivered with the casual, logistical tone of a man canceling a dinner reservation. I had just drifted off, the pain medication pulling me into a shallow, restless sleep. His voice sliced through the fog. "I'm going to go stay at my mom's for a while," he said, still facing away from me. I pushed myself up on my elbows, a jolt of fire spreading from my incision. "What? Why?" He finally turned, his expression not angry or sad, but impatient, annoyed, as if I were a logistical problem he was tired of solving. "Look, Alana," he sighed, running a hand over his face. "This is a lot. You're going to be laid up for weeks, maybe months." He stood up and started gathering his charging cables from the wall socket. "I was just on the phone with Mama." Of course he was. Rochelle. His mother's voice had become the third and often deciding vote in our marriage. "She said you'll be useless for months," he continued, coiling a white cord with brisk, efficient movements. "And I can't carry both of us." Useless. The word landed with a dead, hollow thud. Not in pain, not recovering, but useless. An appliance that had broken down. An employee who no longer met performance expectations. He framed his departure as a matter of capacity, of load-bearing. I can't carry both of us. The irony was so staggering, so profoundly ignorant of the truth of our marriage, that it almost made me laugh. For 12 years, I had been the load-bearing wall. I had been the foundation, the steel beams, the quiet, unseen infrastructure that held everything up. He hadn't been carrying me for a day. He had just, for the first time, been asked to hold his own weight, and he'd found it too heavy. He packed a small duffel bag with the quiet competence of a man who knows he won't be met with resistance. He didn't look at me as he zipped it shut. He just walked to the door, paused, and said, "I'll text you." Then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and the only sounds left were the puff of the oxygen machine and the frantic, silent screaming in my own head. He hadn't just left me the day after my surgery. He had declared me dead weight and walked away from the wreckage. An archaeology of disrespect is a quiet science. You don't excavate with a shovel. You do it with memory, sifting through the years to find the artifacts of erosion. The work is slow, painstaking. You hold up a forgotten moment to the light and see it for what it was. Not an anomaly, but a data point in a long, clear trend. My marriage to Keith didn't collapse in that moment. It was simply the day the demolition was made official. The structural decay had been happening for years, quietly, behind the drywall of our daily lives. It began, as it so often does, with money. The house, a lovely brick row home in Hompton with a small, struggling garden in the back, was ours. That was the word we used. Ours. But the down payment had come from an inheritance my grandmother left me, a sum I had guarded fiercely until I saw that house. I was the one who spent months negotiating with the bank, whose credit score was the bedrock of the mortgage application, whose name was on the pre-approval letters. Keith was enthusiastic, full of vision. He talked about paint colors and where we would put the television. He was the creative director of a project I was financing and managing. The mortgage payments were auto-drafted from my personal checking account every month for 7 years. It was just easier that way. My salary as an HR manager was stable and predictable. His income, from a series of freelance graphic design gigs and short-lived startup enthusiasms, was not. I created the budget. I paid the bills. He would transfer me money for utilities and groceries, often a few days late, with a casual, "Sorry, babe, client hasn't paid yet." I never made it an issue. I was the stable one, the planner. I saw it as my role in the partnership, the part of the load I was best equipped to carry. I mistook his financial unreliability for creative spirit. I mistook my own quiet resentment for mature acceptance. I was, in effect, his manager. I was the steady salary that allowed him the freedom to be an artist, yet he had come to see that freedom not as a gift I provided, but as a condition he was entitled to. The erosion was domestic, too. It was in the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom that dripped for 6 months. I was the one who researched plumbers, who compared quotes, who finally took a half-day off work to be there for the repairman. Keith's contribution was to complain about the dripping sound at night. It was in the towering stack of mail on the console table, which I sorted every evening, pulling out the bills, the jury summons, the tax documents, while he flicked through catalogs. It was in the constant, low-level hum of tracking his life for him. "Don't forget you have that dentist appointment on Tuesday," I'd say. "Did you send that invoice to the client from last month? Your sister's birthday is on Friday. I picked up a card for you to sign." I was the outsourced executive function of his life. I managed his calendar, his professional obligations, his familial relationships. He never had to remember a birthday because I remembered it for him. He never had to worry about a late fee because I paid the bills on time. He floated through life on an invisible infrastructure of my labor, and because it was invisible, he believed he was floating on his own. Then there was Rochelle. Keith's mother was a woman who spoke in pronouncements, her opinions delivered as established facts. Early in our relationship, I found her certainty amusing. But over time, her voice began to echo through our home, transmitted through her son. It started with small things. Mama said that shade of blue for the living room will look cheap. I had spent weeks with paint swatches, but my choice was vetoed by someone who hadn't even seen the room. Mama thinks I should be more aggressive in my freelance pricing. Suddenly, the rates we had discussed and agreed upon were insufficient, tainted by his mother's ambition for him. Her influence was the perfect permission structure for his own passivity. He didn't have to form his own opinions or make his own difficult decisions. He could simply import hers. She provided the authority, and he provided the compliance. The most insidious part of the echo pattern was how it was used to manage me. If I expressed frustration about his inconsistent work schedule, a few days later Keith would say, "Mama said the life of a creative is feast or famine, and a supportive partner understands that." My valid concerns were reframed as a lack of support, with his mother as the expert witness. If I was tired after a long week and didn't feel like hosting his friends, he would report back, "Mama said it's important for a man to have his friends around. It keeps him grounded." My need for rest was redefined as an attempt to isolate him. I wasn't in a marriage with one person. I was in a negotiation with a committee of two, and I was always outvoted. Rochelle wasn't just his mother. She was the co-author of his reality, and in their shared narrative, I was a supporting character whose primary function was to facilitate the life of the protagonist. My needs, my career, my exhaustion, they were all secondary plot points, easily edited out if they interfered with the main story. The memory that soured most profoundly was the day we closed on the house. I remember the feeling of the pen in my hand as I signed document after document, my wrist aching. Keith was next to me, vibrating with an almost boyish excitement. He signed very little. Most of the paperwork was for me, the sole name on the mortgage. When it was over, the realtor handed me the keys. I turned and dropped them into Keith's open palm. His face lit up. "We did it, babe," he said, pulling me into a hug. "We own a home." That night, he carried me over the threshold. It felt romantic, cinematic, a perfect start to our life in this house. Now, lying in my recovery bed, that memory played back with a different soundtrack. I remembered the realtor's careful, professional gaze resting only on me when she discussed the financial obligations. I remembered the loan officer explaining the terms of the amortization schedule to me while Keith checked his phone. They knew who was buying the house. I was the one who did it. He was the one who celebrated. His joy wasn't for us. It was for him. He had acquired a home, a major asset, without any of the risk or responsibility. My signature on those papers wasn't an act of partnership. It was the most significant act of unacknowledged, invisible labor I had ever performed. I had carried him over the threshold of home ownership, and he had come to believe he'd walked through the door all by himself. His words, "I can't carry both of us," weren't just cruel. They were a profound misreading of the last 12 years of his life. He wasn't dropping a weight he could no longer carry. He was walking away from the very structure that had been carrying him all along. The first few days after he left were a blur of pain, medication, and the suffocating silence of the house. The puff of the oxygen machine was my only companion. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking to the sharp reminder of my incision and the duller, more persistent ache of his absence. But beneath the grief and the physical misery, something else was taking root. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something colder, more practical. It was the HR manager in me waking up. When an employee abruptly resigns, your first move isn't to mourn their departure. It's to secure company assets and assess the operational impact. You conduct a clear-eyed audit of the situation. My situation was this. My husband, my partner of 12 years, had abandoned me in a state of extreme medical vulnerability. The reason he gave was that he could not handle the burden of my recovery. This was a breach of contract, not a written one, but the fundamental human one that underpins a marriage. My mind, trained to think in terms of policies and liabilities, started to move. What were my assets? What were my liabilities? Where was I exposed? The house. The house was everything. It was our biggest shared investment, the center of our lives. But was it shared? The questions surfaced through the medicinal haze. I thought back to that day at the closing, the mountain of paperwork with my name on it. Keith had been there, but his role had been celebratory, not contractual. Had he ever signed anything of substance? I couldn't remember. It took me 2 days to gather the strength to get out of bed for more than a few minutes. Every movement was a slow, deliberate negotiation with the pain in my abdomen. I shuffled, bent over, from the bedroom to my small home office, my hand pressed against the stitches as if to hold myself together. The office was my domain, a space of meticulous order in a house that often bent to Keith's creative chaos. My file cabinet was locked, not because I had secrets, but because I believe in secure document management. I fumbled with the key, my hand shaking slightly, and pulled open the drawer labeled Home. There it was, the thick file folder, neatly labeled. Inside was a decade of our life together, told through documents, insurance policies, repair receipts, property tax statements, and at the very back, in a protective plastic sleeve, was the deed. My heart was pounding, a dull, heavy thrum against my ribs. I slid the document out. The paper felt cool and important in my hands. I scanned the legal language, my eyes searching for the names, and then I saw it. Owner, Alana Simone Williams. Just my name. My maiden name, in fact. I had bought the house a few months before we got married, and in the whirlwind of the wedding and the honeymoon, we had simply never gotten around to adding him to the title. It was one of those administrative tasks that fell through the cracks. We'd talked about it once or twice, vaguely. Keith had said something like, "We should get that sorted out," but he'd never followed up, never researched the process, never presented me with a form to sign. It was another piece of life admin that he assumed I would eventually handle for him, and I, busy handling everything else, had not. I stood there in the silent office, the deed in my hand, and felt a profound, unnerving stillness descend. It was the feeling I get at work when I have to terminate an employee. After all the performance reviews, the warnings, the mediation sessions, there comes a moment when the decision is made. The emotional turmoil, the frustration, the disappointment, the hope for improvement, all of it ceases. The path forward becomes a simple, linear process. The file is closed. That was the sensation. A quiet click in my mind. The case of my marriage was closed. There would be no appeal. The grief was still there, a ghost in the room, but it was no longer the primary occupant. It had been replaced by a cold, clear certainty. The document in my hand wasn't a weapon. It was a fact, a contractual reality. And in my world, facts and contractual realities were the things you built your next steps on. He had said he couldn't carry us. He had walked out of my house, a house I had paid for and maintained, and called me useless. He had made a catastrophic operational error based on a deeply flawed assumption of ownership. And now, the procedure for offboarding would begin. My recovery became the timeline for my project plan. My body was healing, slowly, and in parallel, I began the methodical process of disentangling his life from mine. The HR manager took over completely. I was no longer a grieving wife. I was executing a workforce reduction. The target was a single, non-performing asset, Keith. I started with a list written on a yellow legal pad with a fine-tipped black pen. The heading was Project KE, Keith Extraction. I broke it down into phases. Phase 1, Asset Consolidation. Phase 2, Communication Protocol. Phase 3, Physical Removal. Phase 4, Security Upgrade. It was absurd, but it was the only way I could process the emotional devastation, by translating it into the bloodless language of corporate restructuring. It gave me a sense of control in a situation designed to leave me feeling powerless. Phase 1 was about securing my assets. I already held the deed to the house, the primary asset. I went online, my laptop balanced carefully on a pillow over my stomach, and methodically changed the passwords to every utility account, every streaming service, every online portal that managed our lives. I opened a new bank account and scheduled a transfer of my next paycheck. I reviewed our joint credit card statements, highlighting his personal expenditures. It was a forensic accounting of our partnership, and it told a story of imbalance that was stark and quantifiable. Phase 2, Communication Protocol, was simple. I would not answer his calls. I would not respond to his texts, which had started to trickle in, casual, clueless messages like, "Hope you're feeling okay," and "Mom's making pot roast tonight. Wish you were here." Each one was a small, sharp sting of his utter obliviousness. My protocol dictated that all communication would be one way, from me to him, and only when operationally necessary. My sister, Maya, was my only confidant. When I told her what had happened and what I was planning, she didn't sound surprised. There was a weary sigh on the other end of the line. "It's about time, Alana," she said. "I'll be there tomorrow." She became my on-site support staff. Maya arrived with 2 suitcases, a cooler full of homemade soup, and the quiet, fierce competence of a field medic. She took one look at my pale face and the project plan on the legal pad and nodded. "Okay, boss," she said. "What's first?" With her help, I began Phase 3, Physical Removal. We moved through the house like auditors, room by room, separating his belongings from mine, his clothes from the closet, his books from the shelves, his half-used bottle of cologne from the bathroom counter. Each item felt both intimately familiar and completely alien. This was the man I had built a life with, and now his existence was being reduced to a pile of objects on the living room floor. I didn't cry. I made decisions. This is his. This is mine. This was a gift from him to me, so it is mine. This was a gift from me to him, so it is his. Maya, seeing the strain on my face, took over the heavy lifting. I sat in a chair, directing the process, a queen overseeing the dismantling of a small defunct kingdom. We packed everything into boxes I'd ordered online. I created a detailed inventory sheet for each box, just as I would for an office move. Box 1, winter sweaters, dress shirts. Box 2, denim, casual pants. Box 3, books, A to L. Box 4, books, M to Z. I printed professional grade labels and affixed one to each box. This wasn't a bitter ex-wife throwing her husband's junk into trash bags. This was a manager facilitating a clean and orderly exit. The process was dignified, methodical, and utterly final. It was an act of profound, quiet violence cloaked in administrative efficiency. He wasn't being erased in a fit of rage. He was being systematically archived. The dramatic irony was thick in the air. While I was curating the museum of our dead marriage, His texts continued to arrive, painting a picture of a man on a temporary, helpful retreat. Mom says you need to be drinking more fluids. Let me know if you need me to pick up anything from the store. He was performing the role of the concerned husband from a safe distance, completely unaware that his position had already been eliminated. He thought he had resigned his duties temporarily. He had no idea he'd been terminated. The final phase was the security upgrade. I scheduled a locksmith for the day the courier was set to pick up his belongings. The locksmith was a kind-faced man who didn't ask any questions when I, a woman clearly recovering from major surgery, asked him to change every lock on the house. He just did his job, handing me a set of new, shiny keys at the end. They felt heavy and powerful in my palm. The courier arrived the next afternoon. 2 men in uniforms loaded the dozen labeled boxes into their truck. The last item I handed them was a small, padded envelope. Inside was his old house key, the one that no longer worked, taped to a crisp, clean photocopy of the property deed. I had highlighted my name. There was no note. The document was the note. It was the final entry in his employee file. It was the exit interview, the severance agreement, and the notice of trespass all rolled into one. As the truck pulled away from the curb, a strange sense of peace settled over me. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of solitude. The project was complete. The file was closed. The temperature in the house felt cool and calm, like an office after everyone has gone home for the day. It was finally, and only, mine. The first text arrived an hour after the courier service confirmed delivery to his mother's address. It was a single question mark. Keith, a man of limited emotional vocabulary, was starting with confusion. I imagined him standing in Rochelle's living room, surrounded by the neatly labeled boxes of his former life, a small padded envelope in his hand. I did not respond. My communication protocol was clear. Radio silence. An hour later, the phone rang. His name flashed on the screen. I watched it buzz on the coffee table, the vibrations rattling against the wood. It rang until it went to voicemail. Then it immediately started ringing again. And again. The shock and denial phase was in full swing. He was pinging a server that was no longer active. The anger and accusation phase began shortly after. The texts became paragraphs, frantic blocks of text message rage. What the hell is this, Alana? You can't just kick me out of my own house. This is insane. You're being so dramatic. I go to my mom's to give you space and you pull this manipulative stunt? After everything I've done for you? This is how you repay me? By throwing me out when you know I'm worried about you? The phrase my own house was the most telling. He had already absorbed the lie so completely that he stated it as fact. His anger wasn't that of a guest being asked to leave. It was the indignation of a landlord being told he had no claim to his property. His accusations were a textbook deflection. I was dramatic, manipulative, crazy. He was reframing my boundary as an attack on his character. It was a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, to cast me as the unstable one and himself as the bewildered victim. I read the messages with the detached interest of a case study. I noted his use of inflammatory language, his attempts to reframe my actions, his complete failure to acknowledge his own. Then I deleted them. Next came the recruiting of allies. My phone rang again. This time, it was Rochelle. I almost answered, out of a long-ingrained habit of politeness, but Maya, who was making tea in the kitchen, saw my face and took the phone from my hand, pressing the red decline button. "Nope," she said, setting a steaming mug in front of me. "The board of directors is no longer accepting appeals." Rochelle left a voicemail, her voice a syrupy blend of condescension and concern. Alana, honey, this is Rochelle. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Keith is just heartbroken. He came here to give you peace and quiet to recover, and you've done this cruel, cruel thing to him. A man needs his home. You can't just put a good man out on the street. Whatever is going on, you need to call your husband and fix this. This is not how a wife behaves. Every sentence was a master class in manipulation. She positioned his abandonment as an act of kindness. She framed my self-preservation as cruelty. She invoked the sanctity of marriage and the role of a wife as a way to shame me back into compliance. But the words had lost their power. They were echoes from a system I had already dismantled. I was no longer an employee of their family. I had resigned. Her pronouncements were policy updates for a company I no longer worked for. The negotiation phase came late that night. A long, rambling voicemail from Keith appeared. His tone had shifted from anger to a sort of wounded pleading. Babe, look. I know I messed up. I shouldn't have said that stuff. I was just stressed. My mom was in my ear. You know how she gets. This is our home. We built a life here. Don't throw that away over one stupid fight. I'll come home. I'll take care of you. I promise. I'll do better. Just let me come home. It was a classic counteroffer, made only after he realized his position was untenable. He offered to do the bare minimum of his job description, taking care of his wife after her surgery, but only as a condition of his reinstatement. He would never have made this offer when he still had access, when my presence was guaranteed. The promise to do better only came after the consequences had arrived. It wasn't remorse, it was panic. I knew I had to speak to him once, not to negotiate, but to formally close the proceedings. When he called again the next morning, I answered. My voice was calm and even. Hello, Keith. Alana. Thank God. Babe, I'm so sorry. I received your belongings, I said, cutting him off. My tone was polite, professional. He was flustered. Yeah, Alana. What was that? The deed? What is wrong with you? There is nothing wrong with me, Keith. I am simply clarifying a factual matter. A factual matter? It's our house. No, I said quietly. It is my house. I bought it, and I have paid the mortgage on it for 7 years. You are not on the deed. You are not on the mortgage. Legally, you were a resident. Your residency has been terminated. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his breathing, ragged and confused. And then came the raw vulnerability, the one moment of pure, unvarnished truth he had ever offered me. His voice was small, stripped of all its bluster. I thought putting it in your name made things easier, he said, the words tumbling out in a confused rush. For the bank stuff. I didn't think that meant it wasn't mine. And there it was. The foundational flaw in his understanding of our entire lives together. He saw my name on the paperwork as a convenience, a logistical loophole he could use to his advantage. He never saw my financial contribution as mine. He saw it as ours, and by ours, he meant his. He had mistaken my support for his property. He believed he was entitled to the fruits of my labor, to the security of my assets, simply by virtue of being my husband. My name on the deed was, to him, a technicality, not the fundamental truth of ownership. I set my cup of tea down on its saucer before I spoke, the small click of ceramic on ceramic, the only sound in the room. I let his admission hang in the air for a long moment, letting him hear the echo of his own profound entitlement. Who told you that wasn't mine? I asked, my voice still quiet, still even. It was a simple question, but it was devastating. It forced him to confront the source of his delusion. Was it his mother? Was it his own internal narrative? He had no answer. There was just more silence. "I have to go, Keith," I said finally. "I need to rest." And I hung up the phone before he could say another word. Rebuilding a life is like launching a new corporate wellness program. You start with a mission statement. Mine was simple. I will no longer be the manager of anyone else's life. My home, my finances, and my emotional well-being are my sole responsibility, and I will not outsource their care, nor will I take on the management of another's. From this mission statement, all other policies and procedures would flow. I rebuilt my life with the precision of an HR professional implementing a new company-wide initiative. The first order of business was establishing clear boundaries, or what I started calling my personal code of conduct. This document, which existed only in my head, had several key clauses. Clause 1. The Rochelle Addendum. Any communication from Keith's family would be met with polite, firm disengagement. When Rochelle called again a week later, I answered, listened to her brief tirade, and then said calmly, "Rochelle, my relationship with Keith is over. I wish you and your son the best, but I will not be discussing it with you further. Please don't call this number again." Before she could respond, I hung up and blocked her number. It felt like revoking a difficult vendor's security clearance. Access denied. Clause 2, the emotional labor cap. I audited my other relationships. Where else was I overextending myself, managing schedules, and remembering birthdays for people who didn't reciprocate? I stopped reminding friends about upcoming plans. I sent group texts for organizing get-togethers instead of coordinating with everyone individually. The result was interesting. Some friendships faded, revealed to be sustained only by the scaffolding of my efforts. Others deepened as friends stepped up to meet me halfway. I was downsizing my emotional portfolio, divesting from non-performing assets, and reinvesting in relationships with a clear, mutual return. The house itself became my primary rebuilding project. For years, it had been a space I administered but never fully inhabited. Its decor was a series of compromises between my taste and Keith's, which was heavily influenced by Rochelle's. The first thing I did once I was mobile enough was to paint the living room. I chose a deep, calming shade of teal, the very color Rochelle had once declared cheap-looking. As I rolled the paint onto the walls, covering up the bland beige Keith had insisted on, I felt like I was physically reclaiming my territory. Each stroke was an act of quiet defiance. This is my space, my choice, my home. I went through the house room by room, curating it to my own life. I turned Keith's old creative space, a room that mostly housed his dusty art supplies and unfinished projects, into a bright, beautiful yoga and meditation room. I bought a new couch, one that was comfortable for me and not just big enough to fit all of his friends for game night. I filled the shelves with my books, not his. The house began to breathe differently. It was no longer a shared space of unspoken resentments. It was a sanctuary tailored to one person's peace. Mine. My work life sharpened in focus. Freed from the constant, low-level cognitive load of managing Keith's life, I found I had more energy, more creativity for my actual job. I spearheaded a new mentorship program at my company, a project I'd been wanting to launch for years, but never had the bandwidth to tackle. It was successful, earning me a promotion and a significant raise. The irony was not lost on me. The man who had called me useless had been the single biggest drain on my utility. By removing him, I hadn't just survived. I had become more productive, more successful, more myself. Vindication was not a loud, triumphant event. It was a quiet accumulation of peaceful moments. It was waking up on a Saturday morning and deciding on my own schedule without having to navigate someone else's moods or whims. It was paying my mortgage and knowing, with bone-deep certainty, that I was investing in my own future, my own security. It was looking around my beautiful, teal-walled living room, a space that reflected me completely, and feeling not lonely, but whole. The ultimate vindication wasn't that he was miserable. I had no idea if he was, and I found I didn't care. The vindication was that I was profoundly, unshakably at peace. I had successfully restructured my life, and the new organization was lean, efficient, and profitable in the only currency that now mattered to me: contentment. About 6 months after he left, I saw him. It was a Tuesday evening at the Wegmans in Columbia, a neutral territory far enough from my neighborhood that I hadn't expected it. I was in the produce section, trying to decide between kale and spinach, when I heard a hesitant, "Alana?" I turned. It was Keith. He looked ordinary, smaller than I remembered somehow. The larger-than-life presence he had occupied in my home and in my head had shrunk to the dimensions of a regular man in a slightly wrinkled t-shirt. He was holding a basket with a single frozen pizza and a 6-pack of beer. "Hi, Keith," I said. My voice was even, betraying none of the faint, vestigial shock I felt. "You look good," he said, his eyes scanning my face. "Really good. Healthy." "I am," I said. It was a simple, factual statement. An awkward silence stretched between us, filled only by the hum of the refrigerated cases. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the picture of a man who had lost his script. I hear you got a promotion," he said. "My mom saw it on LinkedIn." "Yes," I said. "It's been a great opportunity." I offered no more details. My professional life was no longer a topic for his family's discussion. He nodded, looking down at the pizza in his basket. "That's great. That's really great." He looked back up at me, and for a second I saw a flicker of the man I had once loved, a flash of vulnerability, of regret. "Listen, Alana, about the house." I held up a hand, a small, gentle gesture. "The house is fine, Keith. I'm fine. There's nothing to talk about." My calmness seemed to deflate him completely. He was prepared for a fight, for lingering anger, for tears. He was not prepared for my serene, impenetrable peace. He was a former employee trying to relitigate the terms of his termination with a manager who had already moved on to hiring his replacement. In this case, myself. "Right," he said, his voice flat. "Okay." "It was good to see you, Keith," I said, giving him a small, polite smile. I placed my chosen bag of spinach in my cart and pushed it past him, continuing down the aisle. I did not look back. I felt no anger, no sadness, no triumph. I felt nothing at all but the mild, pleasant anticipation of the dinner I was about to make for myself, in my own quiet, peaceful home. He was a closed file, a case study in a textbook on bad partnerships, a footnote in the story of my own becoming. For years, I believed that love was a management role. I thought the work of a partnership was to identify the other person's weaknesses and build systems to support them. I managed my husband's finances, his schedule, his family obligations. I created buffers, drafted contingency plans, and absorbed the impact of his failures. I thought this was the definition of support. I was wrong. That isn't support. It's infrastructure. And when you become someone's infrastructure, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a utility, something that is simply supposed to work, silently and in the background. When it breaks, it's not a tragedy, it's an inconvenience. There is a profound difference between partnership and ownership. A partner respects your contributions, an owner assumes them. A partner values your autonomy, an owner sees it as a threat to their comfort. I had willingly participated in the erosion of my own sovereignty, mistaking my capacity to endure for the virtue of loyalty. I thought that by carrying everything, I was making our lives stronger. But I was only making him weaker and myself more invisible. Leaving wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of clarification. It was a long overdue correction on a contract whose terms had been misread for more than a decade. The truth is, some people can only learn the value of a system when they experience a system failure. Some people only recognize the load you were carrying after you've set it down. My peace was not his punishment. It was the natural, inevitable consequence of a well-managed life. It was the dividend paid on an investment I had finally decided to make in myself. I no longer manage anyone but me. The work is challenging, the responsibility is total, but the rewards are beyond measure. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.